Welcome to the London Politica podcast. This is where we join industry thought leaders and experts to uncover the nexus of politics, markets, and society. My name is Manas Chawla, and I'm so thrilled today to be joined by Jonathan McClory. Jonathan is a partner at Sanctuary Counsel, the author of the Soft Power 30 Index, and he's an expert in soft power, public diplomacy, and cultural relations. In the past, he's held positions at Portland Communications and the Institute for Government. Jonathan, it's so wonderful to have you.
Thanks for having me, Manas. Pleasure to be here.
So, I want to start off by talking a bit about, your main idea, soft power. You've been at the forefront of studying and measuring this for the better part of a decade at various institutions. And for the purposes of the indexes that you've created, you've defined soft power as the use of attraction, persuasion to change another country's behavior. And firstly, I'm just curious if, that's the one universal definition of soft power, or if you've ever kind of run into any opposition on that particular conception. And also, I'm wondering, do you sort of see any distinction between the way that academics and the way that, practitioners and diplomats conceptualize a soft power?
Sure. Well, in defining soft power for the purposes of my research, I borrowed very heavily from what Professor Joseph Nye, who originally coined the term, what he laid down as the definition. And I think that's all pretty clear, right? And that definition you quoted would have been, I think, probably lifted from either his 2004 book or the 1990 essay that he wrote setting out soft power. That said, it's always helpful whenever having these conversations just to make sure everyone's on the same page with definitions. When I do that, I tend to start with defining soft power by what it isn't. So against hard power, right? And hard power being the use of coercion through either military force or the threat of force, economic sanctions, or also it doesn't have to necessarily just be negative. It can be paying somebody to do something, right? Inducements of payments is effectively hard power as well. So soft power is not those things. It's attraction, it's persuasion, it's getting others to want what you want. And another thing that Joseph Nye says or writes quite often is the idea that soft power's ability is about not power over others, but power with others, right? Bringing them onto your side and then working in concert towards some objective or goal. I think I've never really received pushback, I suppose, on that kind of definition. But where you run into trouble, and in some ways this is a mark, I guess, of the success of soft power as a concept, is the way that the meaning has been stretched a bit to be deployed on any number of things that it just doesn't necessarily have a business on being deployed on. So, one example is, of course, I have a Google alert that I get on soft power, right? So, every day I just want to see what's popped up, any news articles or whatever. But some of the stuff that you wind up getting with this Google alert that has absolutely nothing to do with, the soft power that we're talking about. It's ridiculous. So from, things, just sort of description of, deployed in fashion or, whatever it might be, it just gets stretched a bit. And that's something we have to be careful of. And that's why I do think it's worth, whenever having these discussions or, settling into to write a long piece on it, it's always worth, might feel redundant, given the audience will probably know, but it's worth going over the definitions. But that's basically how I would define it. And then to your second question around academics versus practitioners, I wouldn't necessarily say there's a divide between academics and practitioners exactly, because I think, not all academics will think about it in the same way. I think roughly everyone will have the at least IR academics will have the same kind of idea in mind for the definition. They'll differ on the extent to which they think it's effective or useful or germane. Whereas practitioners, I don't think there's a division there. I think likewise there'll be practitioners who think this isn't as important and it's all about hard power. I think that's probably more the divide. Whether you're an academic or a practitioner, are you more kind of realist minded? Are you more constructivist or neoliberal institutionalist, whatever it might be. I think that's probably the divide rather than a kind of, academics versus practitioners.
Really interesting. And I mean, since we're doing this virtually because of the pandemic, I'm also really curious to know how that perception of soft power you just described is evolving as a result of the COVID pandemic. Because of a recent publication you conducted, a series of roundtable discussions of the future of soft power and public diplomacy. I'm curious, what were a couple of the biggest takeaways, and was there anything that surprised you?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things we set out to test with this recent research project was obviously we wanted to get a sense of who were the winners and losers in terms of soft power and reputation. How different countries have handled the pandemic, but taking one step back from that, we wanted to test whether the way people think about soft power, the way that they form their opinions of countries, had that changed at all as a result of the pandemic? And so in this research, I mean, we convened these roundtables, and during these roundtables, we also ran flash polling. So we would have immediately comparable data across these 7 different groups, which are, spread out all over the world. And what we found was that, overwhelmingly, I think it was 91 or 92% of our participants said that they had changed either the composition or the weighting of the factors that shape their opinion of another country. So essentially, it had changed the way they think about the soft power of countries. Is country X or country Y attractive? The pandemic has had an effect on that. Now, I think where I would be a bit self-critical, although we were sort of limited by the amount of time we could detain all of these important and busy people, was that we didn't drill down into that enough. So we tested that, yes, they have changed the way they think about countries and form their opinion, and so the factors that account for a country's soft power have changed, but we didn't get in exactly to the how. So what does it mean? Now we can extrapolate from this and say, okay, well, if the pandemic has changed the way people think about countries, probably has something to do with government competence. It probably has something to do with their public health infrastructure. Might have something to do with their kind of life sciences industry, pharma industry, innovation, research capacity, willingness to collaborate on public health and things like that. Don't know that for sure. That's certainly something that we want to explore going forward. And this new research report is very much, under a Sanctuary Council banner. It's our kind of first foray into research in this space. I mean, I've been doing it for a long time myself, but under a Sanctuary Council banner, it's new. So this is a platform for us to build on. So we plan to do more work and research in this space, and that's certainly one of the areas I want to drill down in quite a bit more. So that was kind of for me, that was the really big takeaway, that these people that are working in and around experts, practitioners in foreign affairs and public diplomacy, that they had changed the way they think about soft power countries, the way they shape their opinion of countries. And then the things that, I mean, maybe it wasn't a huge surprise, but it just confirmed what we sort of assumed, which was, the U.S. has done horribly out of this. And we, on our survey, it was in fact 100% of the respondents said that the U.S. came out a loser as the result of the pandemic. Now, it's worth saying that we did these roundtables at the very end of 2020, so it was clear that President Trump had lost the election, but he was still in power as a lame duck president. So the way that since Biden has come in, obviously there's a huge step change in vaccine rollout and all of that. And the U.S. has done better. I would say end of 2020 was probably the nadir of America's performance in handling the pandemic. But at least it confirmed that. And then obviously because the bilateral relationship that is going to shape global geopolitics for the next few decades is U.S. and China. So of course we asked our participants, well, how did China do? Were they winner or loser, or no impact, or you're not sure? And a majority felt that China had come out a loser effectively, that had a negative impact on Chinese soft power. But it was much more mixed, much more nuanced. There were some people who thought China came out pretty well as a result of the pandemic, and it was mixed geographically as well. So it was actually Europe and Asia are participants in those two groupings who felt China perhaps did a bit better than others were willing to give them credit for. So I'd say those were some of the big ones. I mean, the other thing was, as you say, we're doing this virtually, and that was kind of the impetus for the research, is we wanted to understand how have diplomats coped with this being the only way that you can engage with people. And the consensus view was that public diplomats could get about 50% of what they needed to get done. They could manage with just digital means, which is both encouraging and depressing, I think, at the same time. I mean, it's quite good when you think you can't have human contact, but we could still do about 50% of what we need to do. But that's a big loss. I mean, losing 50% of what you would like to be able to do as a diplomat that's a huge blow. And while that was majority, I mean, there were people who said we can only do 25% of what we'd like to be able to do, and a small number said we can't operate effectively. So that's worrying. And then I think the other big theme that came out was this was particularly strong in the US and UK groups, was the need to link domestic politics and the day-to-day lived experiences of citizens with foreign policy development, but also the practice of engagement and public diplomacy. This is a big deal, I think, for the UK and the US, and no easy answers on how exactly to do it. But it was seen as a big priority for those two countries going forward.
Yeah, no, really fascinating. I'm glad you kind of touched on the American aspect of it, because that's certainly something that caught me by surprise. I mean, the overwhelming plurality of respondents in your sort of roundtable discussions did not think that American soft power could recover to pre-Trump levels within the foreseeable future. And I personally, I'd say I sort of disagree. I mean, I'm not saying the U.S. is going to magically regain its dominance on the world stage overnight, but I do think the fundamental contributors to sort of American soft power, like some of the things that you've measured yourself on the index. I mean, I don't think Trump was able to damage many of those in a particularly irreversible way. Like you think, American tech companies still lead the way in connecting the world. American universities are still, leading every field. America's still one of the best places to start a business. And that's not to minimize the fact that obviously Trump frayed relations with a lot of allies, especially across the pond, in a very serious way. But again, like you mentioned, Biden's response to that, it hasn't been as sort of, replete with showmanship as Trump's might have been, but in a bit more than 100 days, he's gotten quite a bit done. Brilliant vaccine rollout, social welfare programs, a lot of sort of foreign engagement. Secretary of State Blinken right now met with Asian allies during the Quad summit. He's in the Middle East right now, easing tensions after the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. So like, before I ramble on any further, it seems like they're doing all the right things. And it's hardly been more than 100 days, but I want to get your personal take on this. I mean, how feasible do you think is sort of the American goal of regaining pre-Trump levels of soft power? And what do you think Biden needs to do to get there?
So I take your point. It's kind of a recurring theme with the US anyway, that American soft power, it ebbs and flows. You think back to the Vietnam War, for example. I mean, that was not a great time for American influence or soft power, or even before then, or I suppose it was happening concurrently. But civil rights struggle and how far the US has had to come on that, and still has a ways to go. That was used very effectively by Soviet Union propagandists. Look at the way US treats its minorities. And then Iraq invasion, Bush administration, again, US reputation in soft power was pretty low then. And it does bounce back. I mean, it absolutely bounced back under the Obama administration. I mean, and not just in sort of the work that I've been doing on measuring, but if you look at Pew Global Attitudes or Simon Anholt's Nation Brand Index, the U.S. had a huge rebound from the end of the Bush administration to Obama. But having said that, I think, and I'm certainly not the only one to say this, I think we reference a couple of different pieces that were recently in Foreign Affairs in the report, that now in the back of allies' minds will be this sort of, okay, if you elected Trump once, you're capable of doing it again, or someone like him. And I think what worries allies so much is the breakneck speed at which he just yanked the US out of agreements that were made under the Obama administration, which then has allies thinking, if I sign X deal with you, or treaty, or there's whatever American commitment has been made, can that survive the next administration? And that will always be in the backs of allies' minds. I mean, we'll see what happens in the after the 2024 election, and maybe one more cycle without someone so capricious and damaging to the forgive me for using the term, but the international rules-based order. Then maybe those feelings and those concerns will recede a bit more and become just a sort of faint afterthought. But right now, I think they are still, they're very much there. And so it is a problem. But I take your point that Trump wasn't able to damage those kind of bedrock institutional soft power assets, like Silicon Valley, like Hollywood, like, Ivy League universities, all of those things that continue to make the US attractive, no matter who's in charge. And that has always been, thinking about the soft power 30 and the breakdown of the way that the US performs in that and its soft power resources. It's always been strongest in the areas that have nothing to do with government, and this is a point that Joseph Nye makes a lot, not just with respect to the US, but also with respect to China, and that China is kind of handicaps itself in a way in that it has no civil society. Civil society and those things that exist outside the control of government are so important, and there is nothing in China without the state. Effectively, there is no civil society, and that really limits Chinese soft power. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling a bit on that, but I basically would say I probably fall in line with the plurality right now. My immediate concern is I don't think before the next election that the US will recover we'll be able to hit those sort of, pre-November 2016 highs. But, if we can get through another election cycle with someone who is, in the White House that is going to broadly champion the rules-based order and wants to, promote and ensure American leadership in ways that are seen to be, and in fact are good for the global community, as opposed to regress back to America first and you losers are all on your own. Then yeah, I suppose in the more medium term it's possible. I'm not super optimistic right now, but it's still I think it's a huge recovery from where we were this time last year, certainly. That sort of to me that. Well, not just to me, but I think to data in my research, but other studies as well, that 2016 is that high watermark, and we're some way away from that, even if we've made great strides.
And yeah, I mean, I do completely take your kind of first point, which was, the very specific way that Trump damaged relations with allies, and that, they're not sure if they can trust the Americans in these sort of agreements right now. And I think that's not only with allies, but, even potential, competitors, if you might put it. We're seeing that right now front and center in the negotiations taking place in Vienna between Americans and the Iranians, indirectly through the Europeans. And, both sides want to get back into the nuclear deal, but there's all these sort of wild complications for months about, the Iranians still aren't confident, neither are the Europeans to some extent, that this is going to be more than a one-term deal, and they want some sort of clause that binds them to that, despite administrations changing, something like that. But I also really liked your point about the part that government plays in American soft power being, comparatively minimal compared to sort of other countries. And that's one thing I've noticed. We, did a Klein project recently at London Politica, and comparing kind of Chinese and Russian types of soft power to the American ones. This might just be perhaps my Eurocentrism, but it seems like the American variant of soft power is a lot more organic. It stems from businesses, it stems from tech, it stems from civil society. And if you look at Chinese soft power, uh, admittedly, China has a very rich culture, but it's still bolstered by, for instance, the CCP's program of establishing these Confucius institutes abroad. Or maybe it has great sort of economic incentives, but it's still established by that very state-led Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm wondering, do you agree with that kind of distinction between Western countries and non-Western countries, and the organic and sort of more artificial, um, manufactured types of soft power?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there is nothing in China without the state, or at least a heavy state backing or sanction. And you're right. I mean, the Chinese culture is incredibly rich, heritage culture, but contemporary culture as well. I mean, if you look at, say, I suppose right now, if you were to kind of poll people, what the most famous contemporary Chinese artist right now is Ai Weiwei, who is effectively in exile, and the government is not a fan of his at all. And it's weird because any other, well, certainly sort of Western country would be very happy to give a platform to one of their artists like that, but in China it's not the case. And then Nomad, the film which just won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and I think Best Director, was directed by a Chinese-born film director, and there's hardly any mention of her apparently at all in Chinese media or social media, because she doesn't quite fit the bill, I guess. But you're right. It's kind of about heritage culture. It's state backed, and I think there is. I mean, one of the things that came out in the roundtable discussions from this last research project is that there was a sense that there's kind of growing distrust in government anyway. And I think that's citizens having less trust in their own government, but that also holds true for having trust in other governments. And if that's the case, then, public diplomacy efforts, whatever they might be, that seem to have a very heavy government fingerprint, are going to be less effective, because there's greater cynicism or skepticism about sort of that government-backed initiatives or platforms. And there is no non-government backed platform when it comes to Chinese outreach. So I think that creates problems. However, I mean, there's a lot of talk about sort of where is the theater for competition in influence between the US and China. There's a lot of talk of Africa and Latin America, and those countries that aren't democratic, where you're just speaking to a sort of elite or just the government, and they don't really want to be lectured about democratic reforms or human rights reforms or whatever. I mean, that can also put China at an advantage. So it all kind of depends on who are you trying to engage with? Who's the audience effectively, right? What's the context there? So it's heavily dependent on who are you trying to talk to. But I definitely agree with that wider point about sort of inorganic versus purely state-controlled efforts.
Mm-hmm. And while we're talking about kind of Africa and Latin America and Central Asia in the way that they extend Chinese influence, I mean, that's one thing that's always puzzled me, is like in a large way that they do that is through all these Chinese economic incentives, building dams, building roads, building massive energy grids. And I'm wondering what's your take on that, in terms of, is that soft power or is that hard power? Because on the one hand, it's sort of like, you're giving these people sort of very generous loans that they wouldn't get from the Americans unless they changed into, quote unquote, more democratic institutions. But then on the other hand, there's a lot of sort of alarmist commentary about the way China engages in debt trap diplomacy, and essentially it's just an instrument of coercion. So yeah, how would you look at that? Is that soft power? Is that hard power?
Blurred lines for sure. I don't think it's simply one or the other. I think elements of it are soft power, but then when it does become debt entrapment, that then does work out to coercion. But at the same time, it could just be inducements. It's just paying people to bring them around to what you want them to do. So it's very great. I think there are a lot of missed opportunities. I mean, I know one of the criticisms as well of big Chinese infrastructure projects in emerging market countries is that they bring all of their own engineers and their own labor essentially, and there's no kind of skills transfer or anything like that. So there would be an opportunity to train up either engineers and the construction workers and what have you, to make sure that all these can be maintained, and that there's a level of skills transfer, skilling up, what have you. But if it's all just sort of we come in, we do this, and then we leave, and that's it. And by the way, where's our money back? That's not that doesn't strike me as soft power. But if it was done in the right way with more of that, it could be. But it is a blurred area. These aren't sort of perfectly distinguishable all the time.
Yeah. And, I think it might go farther than that. I don't think it's just, there's no skills transfer. It might even be kind of a negative impact, because I was reading something yesterday and it was about how, China built, almost entirely built the African Union headquarters. And a couple of years later, some engineers in it realized that basically every desk, every wall, even glasses were tapped. They were secretly kind of relaying information back to China, leaking emails, leaking phone calls, voice messages. And they've built, the parliaments of 7 countries. And I think there's only one country in Africa that doesn't have any Chinese development projects yet. And maybe it's sort of a slow realization to that kind of trend. But I think it's certainly one that, just eventually might harm their soft power, or, other countries' tendencies to accept these sort of ostensibly generous economic programs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, while we're talking about China, I mean, I want to tackle the human rights aspect a little bit, because, like you pointed out in the Portland report a couple of years ago, a lot of the disillusionment with China and Chinese values and influences it's a consequence of, the crackdown in Hong Kong, say, or the detainment of 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think these sort of very serious human rights abuses, to what extent does that shape the perception of soft power? How much of a difference do they really make?
Yeah. Well, I think it is making a difference in countries where those values are important, where people would expect human rights to be respected of their own government, and as a result, others. But amongst the leaders of other countries that are autocratic or not terribly democratic, they don't really care. So it boils down to, who's the audience again? Who are we talking about? And I think there are real problems with the Uyghur, Hong Kong, there is no real answer for it apart from kind of anger from Chinese diplomats. I mean, what we saw the exchange in Alaska, right? Just the sort of, how dare you lecture us, that sort of thing. So they don't really have a response for it. And, it was quite remarkable seeing in the run up to just before the Biden transition, the European Union trying to push through that trade and investment deal with China. And we look at it now, and it's frozen in the EU Parliament after a tit for tat exchange of sanctions based around human rights concerns, and it's going nowhere. So to me, that's clearly cause and effect of, you are not respecting human rights. There are all these concerns, and the result is, well, this trade and investment deal isn't going to happen now. I can't imagine it will be recovered, and certainly in the near future. I think that's effectively on ice for however many years. So yeah, I think it's a huge problem. Again, in those countries where things like human rights are important, but where they're not, then I don't think it matters all that much.
Yeah, and I mean, like, man, I think that that's quite an interesting dilemma in the way we think about soft power because we always think about it, or at least traditionally, like country A has soft power X, B has soft power Y, but in large degree, it's contingent on the sort of who the soft power is being exerted upon, and the kind of receiving side of it, and all these countries you think might actually be the ones opposing the Uyghur crisis really aren't, right? Like you think about the Muslim countries in the Middle East, you think about Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan recently has been helping China arrest some of the people that have escaped Xinjiang and the detention centers there. Um, and so, how do you think we can kind of go about shaping our understanding around that? Because I can imagine it's quite hard to drill it down empirically. Once you think about a country, it's easier to just put down a number and say that's its soft power, but it's much harder to classify its soft power with all other types of actors. But how do we kind of add that nuance to this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think with studies like the Soft Power 30, it's helpful to have this sort of aggregate, global, sweeping view. As you say, this is country X's soft power is this much, versus the other. It's still kind of helpful to have that overarching picture. However, when you get down to an operational level, then you absolutely do have to be drilling down to, well, what exactly are we talking about? What's the issue? What's the objective? And then who is I hesitate to use the word target or audience, right? And really, I mean, that's when, certainly work that I've done, that's when you're drilling down into a specific country. So you sort of set that aggregate picture to one side and say, okay, well, what do I know about the way, to take your example, either Pakistani leadership or Pakistani public feel about Chinese foreign policy, or whatever it might be. You really have to drill down into the specific country, or at least the region. Otherwise, that kind of global sweeping view, operationally, it's not going to be that helpful. I mean, in the way that I had designed not just Soft Power 30, but the previous index that I built at the Institute for Government, was the ability to do that, to break down by country or region, particularly on the subjective side of the data, and answer some of those questions, because you have to drill down to that level if it's going to be operationally useful. I mean, the only reason, or the only instance where a kind of big sweeping global view might be useful is when you're dealing with something that is totally globally all encompassing. So I mean, maybe something like climate change, or I mean, vaccines. We haven't touched on that yet, and but that is the global public going to trust the vaccine that country X has developed? Or are they going to run a mile from it? Looking at, say, Pfizer versus AstraZeneca versus Sputnik 5 versus Sinovac and that sort of thing, where a global picture could be useful. But if it's quite specific stuff, then you've really got to drill down to region or individual country.
Yeah. And again, just sort of taking this China point a bit further, I mean, but also more broadly, when these kind of human rights abuses happen, what do countries do to amend their status and amend their kind of soft power influence on the world stage? Or to sort of put it in a more abstract way, is soft power fungible? Is there any amount of Chinese investment in Africa or Russian support in Central Asia that can somehow make up or offset sort of other detriments of soft power? Or will that always be, something kind of ineradicable?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the great question of all power, I suppose, in international relations, right? Is it fungible? Yes and no. That's such a cop-out answer, but yes and no. In some areas, I think it will help, and it is transferable, but not universally so. And I think some of the attacks against soft power from colleagues who might be of a more realist mindset would make that point exactly. Well, it can't get you this or it can't get you that, and I think that's true. And I would never, even though as somebody who's dedicated a lot of time to the study of soft power, I would never advocate it as the sort of universal silver bullet. It is one tool in the foreign policy toolbox, and in some cases, it is the best tool to use. but it's not the only one, and in plenty of cases it won't be the best tool to use. I mean, sometimes you do need old-fashioned hard power in some situations. Yeah. So and to go back to your kind of original point in question about how do you offset human rights abuses, I mean, you stop doing it. That's really the only way to do it. And in particular, it's, a lot of countries, because when you get into some of the practical uses of soft power, you start to stray into things like country reputation or nation branding. It's a lot of those kind of middle income rising countries that want to get, sometimes deservedly so, but they want credit for progress that they've made in either economic development or political progress, whatever it might be. And if they have a history of problematic human rights, I mean, you can't just whitewash that away, right? I mean, the only way to truly deal with it is to stop doing those things and make amends for them, through action, as opposed to, well, maybe if we build more libraries and museums, then everyone will forget about the fact that we have gulags, or whatever it might be. So I don't think there is one particular pursuit of a soft power resource that can offset something that is critically negative for a country. You just kind of can't do it. And those countries that are at the top of, again, whether it's soft power 30 or kind of somewhat similar studies like the Anhalt, nation branding index or whatever, they have a great balance across all these different concerns and points. And I mean, one thing I would say as well is, from the Soft Power 30 Index, and I think this is echoed in other studies as well, the thing that really drives opinion, or at least did in these studies 2015 to 2019, the biggest factor shaping opinion of a country is based on whether or not they're seen as being a force for good in the world. Are they making a positive global contribution, or are they a net detractor from the global community? And even if it happens within the borders of one single country, I still think those human rights abuses have a negative impact. And well, we've just seen this week, right, the spillover that can happen when a egregious human rights abuser like Belarus can make those human rights abuses international very quickly. In ways that were unexpected, with this, outrageous act of air piracy, and even some have called it, state-sponsored terrorism, and that all comes from being a horrible actor in terms of human rights. So yeah, there's no really getting around that, and that will continue to be an albatross around China's neck, again, in those countries where human rights and respect for human dignity are important.
Mm-hmm. And as this kind of discussion of soft power, evolves, I mean, I noticed the academic literature on this and most of the research around this has largely been on, soft power of countries. But what would you say sort of about the devolution of that power to non-state actors like, maybe businesses or civil society or extremist groups? Because just intuitively, I feel like there's some amount of soft power that, say the Taliban has, that's allowed it to, keep sort of quite a formidable response to the largest army on earth, and keep, the strong that it has over Afghanistan, or, even some amount of soft power that an entity like Tesla or Facebook has that goes beyond its balance sheets. Do you think that's an area that deserves our attention, the soft power of non-state actors?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And to your Taliban example, I mean, I think it was the Future of Power, Joseph Nye's 2011 book. I think it's in that one that, he talks about, again, this goes back to the point of it's all about the audience. But he talks about the soft power of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who I suppose was still alive at the time. That, to the right audience, those sorts of values and principles and I suppose policies and action will be attractive. But Yeah, companies as well. I mean, international organizations, definitely think tanks, pressure groups. Yeah, they all have an important role. I also think, subnational governments as well, regions, cities, have a big role to play. Not just in sort of how do they, shape a positive image and then promote themselves abroad, but if you look at, for example, the C40 group of mayors, that have come together and they're trying to advance the, combating climate change agenda, and those are effectively non-state actors, and even individuals, Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, and what she's done for girls' education. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think beyond just recognizing it, I mean, the next step is then, okay, well, can we quantify it in any way, and how do we do those sorts of things? And that I think would be very interesting. I mean, the only thing that really comes to mind, and I think it's just a group of editors and correspondents sitting around a table, is like the foreign policy magazines, whatever they call it, the Global 100 Thinkers or whatever, which is sort of like that, at least for individuals. But I think that would be really interesting to try and quantify, who really has this soft power and how is it wielded and those sorts of things. So I think that's definitely ripe for further exploration. I certainly agree with the premise.
Mm-hmm. No, brilliant. I mean, that was a really, really fascinating conversation, Jonathan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And to find out more about London Politica, please visit our website, londonpolitica.com, and follow us on LinkedIn. But yeah, no, that's all for this episode, folks. Stay tuned, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.